Stormwater Quality Group. We are charged with certain regulatory and public activities aimed at improving watershed protection, stream quality, and that's how we're involved with industrial sites as a component of our program. Involves Ms4 permit compliance that involves industrial facilities. I personally can appreciate that because I came to Metro from heavy industry, so I understand some of the challenges that you all face in managing your site. We hope today that you'll get some specific information about how Metro is involved specifically with your site's regulatory issues, and then just general pollution prevention considerations. You should have contact information with the appropriate staff if you have questions or want to pursue certain issues with us. And then after the presentation today, we'll be sending out a copy of the slides to you along with our staff contact information. So we do appreciate you being online with us today. Again, hope you'll find this useful. We will be putting everybody on mute to begin with, and then once the different sections end, we'll open it up for questions at that point. So if you could just know and hold your questions to that point, we would certainly appreciate it. So with that, one final welcome, and I will turn it over to Josh Hayes, who is manager of our Ms4 Permit Compliance Group. Josh, take it away.
Josh, you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Allison. Sorry about that. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Allison, and thank everyone for being on the webcast today. This is a very important topic for us, as you all know. Industrial facilities now, more and more around Nashville, are being surrounded by higher density residential type development. So there's a lot more ears and eyes on the ground that are seeing what could be tracked out from your site to the roadway or blown off your site with the wind, or discharged from your site. So we get reports of that, and anything that you guys can do to be proactive to keep the materials on your site would be very beneficial to all of us. And Michael kind of touched on the goal of the workshop, so I'll go to the next slide. So here in Nashville, obviously Metro is involved with industrial surface water discharges, but there, as you all know, there's a lot of different regulatory agencies that are involved with surface water discharges. So this portion of the presentation that Allison and I are going to present are all about discharges to the surface water. Discharges that you may pipe out of your facility, or just stormwater runoff from your facility. These are not, we're not talking about in this session right now, discharges to your sanitary sewer. Andy Welch in the following session will discuss industrial regulations regarding discharges to your sanitary sewer. So for discharges to the surface water from industrial activities, obviously it starts with the EPA, and then the EPA has delegated authority here in Tennessee to the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. And so all stormwater, all surface water discharge permits associated with industrial activity are issued by TDEC. Metro Davidson County Metro Water Services does not issue any industrial stormwater or surface water discharge permits. Those are all issued by TDEC. Metro, however, Metro Water Services in particular, we do inspect industrial facilities to make sure that they're complying with their TDEC permits, because a lot of these facilities drain to what we call our municipal separate storm sewer system, or MS4. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. Next slide. So when you're thinking about industrial discharges, surface water discharges, there's really two types of discharges that you need to think about. The first one is process wastewater discharges. This is discharges that when you use water in your manufacturing process, or wastewater is just a byproduct of your manufacturing process, such as if you are using water to cool down machinery and that has to discharge through an outfall outside to the surface water, that's considered process wastewater. That requires separate special permits, process wastewater. And now for most of you, we refer to stormwater discharges for industrial activity. This is any rainwater that lands on your site that may contact industrial processes or material that could drain from your site. It could drain from your site in several different outfalls. So you really got to think about the two types of discharges you have, and that really affects about what types of permits that you need from TDEC. Okay, next slide. The permitting system that TDEC uses, it all really started with the Clean Water Act and the 1972 amendments. And the 1972 amendments really set the limits for the process water discharges that I talked about. Those typical industrial discharges that come out of a pipe that are discharged into either a water body or a ditch. That's really where the 72 amendments focused on, and it created the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. There was limits set on what different industries could discharge. Certain parameters had to be monitored, and they had to be within those limits. In 1987, the new amendments to the Clean Water Act created the Industrial Stormwater Discharge Permitting System. So it's not just point source discharges from pipes, from processed water, industrial sources. Now, any stormwater that is on your site that discharges from your industrial site is permitted. With those same amendments, it also permitted municipalities that had more than 100,000 residents. They have to have their own permits. It's called the Ms4 permit that I mentioned, and that's kind of why we're here today. Okay, next slide. So in Tennessee, in Davidson County, when we're dealing with industrial surface water discharges, there's really three types of permits that we look at facilities. First of all, if a site has a process water discharge, like I talked about, it's a water discharge as part of your industrial process. It's not part of the rainwater. That has to get what we refer to as a MPDS individual permit. And that permit is written specific to that facility. It's a long process to go through to get that permit, and there's specific monitoring that's just written into for that facility. Another permit that we deal with here in Davidson County for surface water discharges is the Ready Mix Concrete General Permit. This permit allows concrete ready mix facilities to discharge both wash water and stormwater. So they can have a process water discharge as well, but it's subject to separate monitoring than their stormwater discharge, and I'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. But mostly what we deal with, and what most of your industries that you're representing today probably deal with, is what we call the General Permit for Industrial Stormwater Runoff, the Tennessee Multisector Permit, Tmsp. And this is a general permit. It's written for the entire state of Tennessee, and it has a bunch of different sectors, and it has different permit requirements for each sector. That's why it's called multi-sector permit. But it's a general permit written to cover a bunch of different types of industries, and there's different requirements per each sector. Okay, next slide. So I mentioned the individual permits. Quick note on those is, again, they are for point source discharges of processed water. And these permits require sampling, analytical sampling, depending on what the permit says. Again, it's written specific to that individual site. But the key thing is they have what they call effluent limitations in their permit, meaning that if they have to sample for total suspended solids, and if their effluent limitation is 50 milligrams per liter, and their sampling that your site does shows that you're over that, then effectively you are in violation of your permit. So that's an important distinction between the individual permits and the Tennessee multi-sector permits that I'll talk about in a minute. But also for the individual permits, one of the key things is all of your outfalls with that processed water discharge have to contain signs. Okay, next slide. For the ready-mix concrete permit, as I mentioned, it permits both wash water discharges, and now that wash water has to go through a series of treatment. pH has to be certain levels, total suspended solids have to be under certain levels, but that wash water is treated like the individual permit process water discharges in that it has numeric effluent limitations. And if you exceed those, you could be in violation of your permit. But if you have other areas of your plant that doesn't have the wash water discharges, it just has stormwater runoff, they contain what is also in our Tmsp permits, but what they call benchmark levels. So if you're required to sample those discharges and you exceed your benchmark levels, you're not technically in violation of your permit. You just have to figure out why you're exceeding those benchmark levels and then take the appropriate action to prevent that from happening in the future. For instance, if you have a pile of sand that's near the outfall, that's getting washed off, that's not covered, that may be the reason that you have higher total suspended solids coming out of that outfall. So you would let TDEC know we exceeded our benchmark levels for TSS during this sampling period, but we made changes to prevent that from the future. So that's the difference between benchmark levels associated with the ready-mix concrete permit and the Tmsp versus numeric effluent discharge limits associated with the ready-mix concrete permit and the individual permit for processed water discharges. Next slide. So what we're here to talk about mostly today is the Tennessee multi-sector permit. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of different sectors depending on what type of industry you are and what sector you fall in. Some sectors require analytical sampling. Others do not. Others just require quarterly visual monitoring of the discharge to see if you have oils or murky water discharging during a rain event. It depends on what sector, and then TDEC has a website, and the link again is in this presentation, but you can go and click on that sector permit and see what your requirements are as far as sampling or visual monitoring go. And again, these use benchmark levels, just like the ready-mix permit. So if you exceed those benchmark levels, if you have sampling required in your permit, you have to figure out why and let TDEC know what changes you are making to the site to prevent that in the future. Okay, next slide. So what constitutes industrial stormwater runoff? What makes your site have to get an industrial permit? Well, it really all boils down to the standard industrial classification code, or what we commonly refer to as the SIC code. If you don't know your SIC code, the OSHA has a really good website that you can go to, and you can search by keywords, and it pulls up all the different SIC codes for that type of industry, and you can figure out what you have. But basically, whether or not you need to get an industrial stormwater permit depends on your SIC code, because some industries are considered commercial and do not need a Tmsp. A good example of that would be landscaping companies. They could have large piles of sand, large piles of mulch, but technically, because of their SIC code, they are not required to get a Tmsp permit. The other factor on whether or not you need to get a Tmsp permit is whether or not you have exposed industrial processes. There are a lot of industrial sites that fall under the SIC codes that require them to get Tmsps, but they have everything located indoors. They have nothing outside that's exposed to stormwater runoff. In those cases, they may qualify to get what's called a no exposure certification form. Next slide. And this is just an example of a copy of a no exposure certification form. If your site is completely indoors, everything's covered, you have no exposure, you can apply for one. So basically, if you're an industrial facility, you need to have one or the other. You need to either have a Tmsp permit or no exposure certification form. When we come to inspect your facility, we're going to ask to see one of them. And the no exposure forms are usually, I think, viable for a 5-year period, and then you have to reapply. But next slide. What TDEC and the EPA considers as exposure are some of the following. If you have industrial machinery that's outside that could have residue or oils or other fluids that could leak from them, they're not covered, they don't have containment under them, that could be considered exposure. If you have material stored outside like piles of sand, other raw materials, that can be considered exposure. If you have loading equipment that's not, that not totally clean, it has industrial product exposed on it that could run off when it rains, that's considered exposure. Any loading or unloading stations that are not covered and contained, that's considered exposure. Next slide. Also, if you have drums stored outside, a lot of people store drums or tanks or bins outside. All that drums have the potential to leak. They have the potential to have residue on the outside of them. If they're not covered or they do not have containment underneath them, that could be considered exposure, requiring you to have a Tmsp permit. And also, lastly, a lot of people don't think about it, but if you have a vent hood on top of your facility, it could be exhausting grease and other residue from your industrial processes that land and settle out on your roof that could wash off. That could also be considered exposure. Next slide. So why is Metro involved? Because I mentioned Metro does not issue the permits. All your permits come from TDEC. We have the Ms4 permit that's issued to us, and this requires us to monitor industrial runoff to our Ms4. It's important to note that a lot of discharges don't route to our Ms4, but almost all of y'all drive on our Metro roadways, and you have the potential to track out on our Metro roadways. So that's really why we're involved, is anything that could get to the Metro Ms4, we have to monitor, and if we find issues, we have to coordinate with TDEC, and we have to pursue to get the industrial facility to clean up the sites. Next slide. Our Ms4 permit covers entire Metro Davidson County, with the exception of the satellite cities and the combined sewer area downtown, which actually the stormwater runoff in that area routes to our treatment plant, and it's more subject to the discharges to the wastewater treatment plant, and Andy will talk about. But that is our coverage area. So if you have an industrial facility located in Davidson County, chances are that we are going to be inspecting you at some point in the future. And I think that's my last slide. Can you advance it? Yep. So now I'm going to turn it over to Allison, who's really going to discuss the main part of our inspection process and what you guys can expect when we come to visit your site and how we coordinate with TDEC.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay. So I've probably met a couple of you out at the site. I'm an environmental compliance specialist and the industrial inspector for our NPDES permit group. Today I'll be discussing how inspections are initiated, the inspection process, including what we review in terms of paperwork as well as during the field inspection, and then the different types of BMPs that can be added to a site to improve stormwater quality and improve your compliance. Okay. So there are two reasons an industrial inspection of a site will occur. The first and the most common is it's just a typical routine inspection, which is required under our Ms4 permit through TDEC. Josh discussed some of the reasons, but the main one is to be proactive and ensuring sites with certain materials and industrial processes have the necessary controls in place to address potential pollution concerns. The second reason is if we receive some sort of citizen complaint or one of our NPDES inspectors observes a stormwater quality issue. The complaints can also be forwarded from TDEC or possibly the EPA, and any findings that we have at the site would be sent and updated to those agencies. For a citizen complaint, the number one type of complaint we receive is site tracking out materials onto a roadway. And we'll address this more in the coming slides. But for each of these inspection reasons, the process would be the same. So before we go out to a site, we'll conduct some sort of office research beforehand. This will include the type of NPDES permit the site holds, if any, looking into any aerial photos and mapped stormwater drainage of the site or the surrounding areas. And then also if the site has any previous correspondence or enforcement issues. If there were issues found at the site during a previous inspection, I would make note of this before going out and check that this issue has been corrected or is being better maintained depending on what the issue is. Even though your industrial facility may be permitted through TDEC and not Metrowater, TDEC does require us to include a review of applicable NPDES permit compliance documentation. That is why we conduct a paperwork review beforehand. So scheduling the inspection, generally inspections from our office will attempt to schedule using the most updated contact available, whether that's through our own database or on TDEC's database that we receive the contact information. The reasons we schedule beforehand is if the facility has any safety requirements. If it's a complaint investigation, we would typically want to meet with an environmental manager if the site has one. Or if it's a follow-up visit from any previous corrective action issues, we would want to meet with the plant operator or manager. So at the start of an inspection, we'll start with paperwork review of any permit documentation needed. The list below is kind of an overview of what we would be looking at. The main thing is the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan. And we'll make sure to look that it's recently updated and signed. If the site is under a no exposure certification or it doesn't require a permit, we would typically skip the paperwork review and do just a field inspection. Another thing we'll be looking at is quarterly visual examinations of stormwater quality, which is essentially the visual monitoring of your outfalls that you are required to do quarterly. If there's any annual analytical monitoring requirements, we would be looking for that. Discharge monitoring reports for facilities with individual NPDES permits, and then employee training sign-in sheets as well. And all of these are usually included within your stormwater pollution prevention plan. So outfalls are one of the main locations that we are looking at when we go to a site. This is where your stormwater exits the facility. It can be through pipes, ditches, swales, and other structures that transport stormwater. An outfall could discharge to a stream or another property or to the MS4. The site is required to determine where these locations are and have a site map within the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan. And then the quarterly visual examinations, sites need to have documentation showing that each stormwater outfall was visually monitored during a rain event. The examiner should be noting the water's color, odor, clarity, and determining if anything is discharging from the site other than stormwater. This is different than a routine inspection. A routine inspection, sites need to have documentation showing that their BMPs are being regularly inspected. These routine inspections may be required to be quarterly, although it is dependent on the permit and the sector that you have. So some of the permits might just say schedule on a regular basis versus quarterly. Once again, these are different than the quarterly visual examinations. Those need to be done during a rain event. These need to be completed just looking at your BMPs that are in place. And these are examples of what the documentation might look like. So material loading or unloading areas, fueling areas, waste handling, disposal areas, salt storage, processing, and we'll get into that a little more. And then lastly, the employee training records. These records should have some sort of signature or name for all the employees trained for the SWEP process. This should be included in your SWEP. And there should be someone at every site that is trained on where the SWEP is and what is included in the contents of it. So paperwork issues or non-compliant issues found at the site are typically found during the paperwork review. Some common findings include the representative might not know where the SWEP is or where other permit paperwork is, such as quarterly inspections, employee training. Another issue is it hasn't been updated since originally drafted. This is a plan that should be updated as your site is updated. It might also be incomplete, missing the site map, missing sampling records. The site map is really important. It's what we go off of when we inspect the site. And then another big issue we find are outfalls aren't properly mapped. So then after the opening meeting and paperwork review, we would go ask the facility representative to accompany us on a field inspection of the property. Specific attention is given to areas that represent the most potential for pollutants flowing off the property. So one of the areas we look at closely are the outfalls. We're checking for any active illicit discharges or unusual odors, any staining, distressed vegetation, debris buildup. These are all signs that some sort of control measure or BMP is failing on the site or is just not in place. We'll also be looking at storage areas, any secondary containment around the outside of the storage tanks. We're specifically looking for staining, spills, leakage. If there is some sort of berm around the tank, we'll be looking to see if there's any standing water within the berm, whether there's a sheen or odor or any discolored water. We'll also be looking at empty drums stored outside. This is a common issue. We'll see residual product on the outside. It might be leaking without caps, without proper control measures in place. Another thing to be aware of is other products being stored on the property in a manner that can contaminate stormwater runoff. An example of this is on auto salvage lots. The junked cars are considered an industrial product, and all the fluids should be drained prior to storing outside. This is the same with old equipment stored at a site. Some other storage areas is product or material being stored, such as stockpile sand, gravel, fines from settling ponds. We'll be looking to make sure that there's some sort of berm in place if it's on the perimeter of the site to keep it on your site. We'll be checking the outfalls to make sure there's no buildup of this material. And also making sure none of this is tracking out onto the roadway. Like I mentioned, if your site has a boneyard, we'll be inspecting that. Any sort of old equipment stored outside can have residual fluids that could wash off during a storm event. Any old metal, old totes, they should be properly stored, not just dumped on the property. Loading and unloading areas. An example of this is rail offloading. Another example is loading docks. We'll be checking if there's any spilled material or staining around these areas, and if there's any cleanup procedures in place for this. Barge loading is another common issue. Whether there's any sand or stockpile buildup along the riverbank or in the river between where the barge and the site is, and making sure there's a cleanup procedure in place for that. Indoor materials draining or seeping outside. This is something that we would ask to be addressed, whether it's to move it indoors further, and also have some sort of cleanup or spill kit put in place. Dumpster areas. This is a common issue. We see leakage. We check to see if the dumpster is covered, plugged. If you do have an opening or a leak from a dumpster, you can request that that company come and bring a new one usually. If there's a compactor, sometimes we see buildup underneath it. So we'll check to see if there's any good housekeeping measures in place to clean this up routinely. A good common practice is also, if possible, to keep dumpsters away from drains and never put them on top of drains. Roof drains, like Josh mentioned earlier, routing potential contaminants located on the roof, such as exhaust hoods, dust collection, coolant towers. We'll be checking the gutters or spouts to see if there's any staining potentially coming from the roof. And then structural controls. We'll be identifying whether there's structural controls designed to treat stormwater runoff, such as detention ponds, underground treatment vaults, and then how well are they maintained, how routinely are they cleaned out. And then this is a big one, site exits and entrances. Is there material being tracked off the site onto a public road? This can lead to ditch or drains being clogged, which can lead to flooding or unsafe driving hazards. And then washing areas. Do you have some sort of equipment, vehicle, or parking lot washing taking place? This is a big note. No commercial or industrial wash water should discharge outside, even if you are using a biodegradable detergent. If you have an outside company used for truck or equipment washing, it is the site's responsibility to make sure that water is captured and disposed of properly. Fleet maintenance areas, is there any fleet maintenance outside or in any sort of exposed area, checking to make sure if any oils or chemicals are stored outside and whether they have proper containment. And then general housekeeping. Is there general trash scattered around the outfall or lot? Does it appear that the lot is regularly swept? Is there gravel areas where trucks drive over, causing a fine dust that could wash off the lot? That would still be considered a pollutant source. Rainwater and groundwater routing to sanitary sewer. Are there drains that receive stormwater or groundwater from sump pumps but route to the sanitary sewer system? This is something that Andy will go a little more into detail with. And then before we go to the site, we'll check aerial photos and see if there's any unpermitted development that has possibly occurred. Metro Water has initiated enforcement for sites developing without obtaining grading permits, especially if you are in a floodplain. And then this is the form. I'm sure some of you have seen it and gotten a copy of it before. We will always allow the representative to make a copy or it will be emailed to you. And then the post-inspection outcomes. So there are three main outcomes from an inspection. In most cases, we will just leave or email a copy of the inspection form if the site is found to be in compliance or it has very minor issues. In some cases, if these minor issues can be fixed quickly, such as cleaning up a small spill or leak or cleaning up debris near the outfall, then I will typically request a picture be sent or emailed once the cleanup is completed, and we would save that to our records. The next outcome is to issue a follow-up letter detailing specific non-compliance issues and requesting a corrective action plan. Typically, we will give the site a couple weeks to put together a corrective action plan and outline specific improvements that would be made, as well as a timeline for these improvements. The final outcome is enforcement, where a notice of violation with an administrative penalty would be issued if we found an active illicit discharge to the MS4 or waterway during the inspection. I want to make note that TDEC is copied on all three of these correspondences. Also, to avoid any confusion, TDEC may issue what they call a notice of violation. This is not the same as our notice of violation. Their notice of violation is similar to what our follow-up letter would be. They would issue it if they found paperwork issues or field issues as well. So this is an example of what our follow-up inspection letter looks like. It is not an enforcement action. And then this is an example of what our notice of violation ticket looks like. It can be accompanied by an administrative penalty that can be calculated up to $5,000 per day. This is what our administrative penalty calculation page looks like. When calculating a penalty, we consider the volume of material lost, whether it is a health hazard, and whether the site has been previously notified of the issue. We have a specific section where this red arrow is for commercial and industrial illicit discharges. This includes industrial waste, hazardous chemicals, including paint, cleaners, oils, batteries, fats, oil, and grease material, which is usually more common for a commercial site, but it can be applicable to certain Tmsp sectors, wash water discharges, any sort of sewage material, and then dumpster leakage. So at the end of our process, if there is an active, unpermitted, illicit discharge, discharges are required to be stopped immediately. In many instances, temporary measures should be deployed to stop illicit discharges to the storm sewer until a permanent solution can be developed. If the permanent solution involves rerouting processed wastewater to our wastewater treatment plants, then it is the facility's responsibility to coordinate with the Metro Water pretreatment section, which would be Andy Welch's group coming up next. Failure to stop illicit discharges will lead to additional enforcement actions that could include assessment of daily administrative penalties or possible court proceedings. This is obviously what we're trying to avoid. So on to the next section, it's potential Bmp types that can be deployed at industrial sites. And some of you may already have some of these deployed, or these can be additionally added to what you have on your site already. So prevention should always be considered as the first plan if possible. Moving things indoors, or if this is not a consideration, covering material, equipment, or storage containers that can potentially wash off with possibly a canopy or a tarp to decrease the likelihood of runoff issues. Obviously, for some sites and industrial processes, this is not going to be an option, but you can always look into whether you have smaller containers or material that could possibly be put indoors, whether it's buckets, drums, totes, or even smaller equipment. Secondary containment is another Bmp and should be considered for any storage containers outside. This is something that may already be required for sites with a SPCC plan and for sites that store certain hazardous materials on site. If a tank has a bermed area which holds water, and I mentioned this a little earlier, the site should check the water for any discoloring or a sheen before releasing or pumping the water out to a stormwater conveyance or outfall. There should be a procedure in place on how to dispose of the water if pollutants are observed. And this is something you may want to have added or is already added to your stormwater pollution prevention plan. A note on the paperwork side is a list of significant spills and leaks of toxic or hazardous pollutants from the past 3 years that occurred in areas exposed to precipitation or drained to stormwater conveyance must be kept within the stormwater pollution prevention plan. This is one of the items we look for when we review the paperwork. And then the site should always have a plan in the event of a spill or leak. This should include a spill kit that is maintained and has the correct material to clean up any type of material kept on your site. Employees should be trained on how to address a spill, be aware of where the kit is located, and who to notify on site, such as a supervisor or plant manager. All spills must be reported to the appropriate agencies, such as first responders, TEMA, or OEM. This is depending on the spill size, of course. Once the spill is soaked up or absorbed, depending on the size of it, the absorbent, booms, or pads used should always be cleaned up also. If absorbent is left on the ground for a long period of time, rain could wash the absorbent and the material off-site, making the process and cleanup completely ineffective. Okay, an example of temporary structure for controlling sediment or aggregate material is drain protection. This is typically seen as either a filter sock or a type of sediment bag used to keep material from discharging down the drain. This requires routine maintenance and scheduled clean out or replacement of the item. These controls should be included in your routine inspections and should be checked to see if they need to be switched out. This is most effective with other control measures in place and good housekeeping. Obviously, this shouldn't be the only form of control measure if a drain is located near a large stockpile. You want to have some sort of berm in place to protect the majority of it, and this would be kind of a secondary control measure to that. Okay, another example of temporary structures for controlling sediment or aggregate material are check dams. These also require routine maintenance and should be cleaned out from sediment buildup. These can be leading up to your outfall possibly. They are also most effective with other control measures in place and good housekeeping. Depending on what sort of check dam it is, you also want to see if those booms or filter socks need to be changed out, and those should also be included in your routine inspection checks. Okay, so material trackout is one of the bigger issues we see, like I mentioned before. Installing structural controls to knock mud, dirt, and dust collected while on site can save a lot of maintenance processes. And examples of these would be potentially wheel washers, trackout control mats, and then in general, improved housekeeping. It is the facility's responsibility to deploy the appropriate BMP to prevent the tracking out of materials. Street sweeping is reactive and should only be performed if the primary BMP fails. Street sweeping is not considered a primary control measure because it is not on your property. And then simple process changes can make all the difference. Good housekeeping is a big example of this. Routine maintenance on problem areas can prevent time, effort, and costs in treating stormwater runoff on the back end. Examples of good housekeeping include sweeping, designated areas for waste, cleaning spills and leaks efficiently and making sure employees are trained on this. Housekeeping completed on site should be listed in your stormwater pollution prevention plan, as well as the frequency of each task. Okay, a routine inspection is also an example of how simple process changes can make all the difference. Routine check, and maintenance on problem areas can prevent time, effort, and spending in treating stormwater runoff on the back end. For most sites, this is also a permit requirement, and it allows the site to check where improvements can be made on a consistent basis. So Metro Water Services has examples of best management practices in detail in the Stormwater Management Manual, which was recently updated in 2021. This is the link to the attachment. There are examples for vehicle and equipment fueling areas, washing areas, loading and unloading, waste handling and disposal, possible employee training efforts. And you will have this PowerPoint sent to you, and we'll be able to access this link afterwards. And then permanent BMPs can also be installed on your property, and may be required to be installed depending on construction related activities. Different examples of permanent BMPs include detention ponds, underground water quality units, oil and water separators, or rain gardens. These structures depend on the site's industrial processes, drainage and site layout, and then also the space available. It should also be understood that these types of BMPs will still require consistent maintenance if they are going to be effective. These permanent structures are most effective with other controls and good housekeeping in place. For more information, you can review our Stormwater Management Manual as well as our Low Impact Development Manual, which goes into specific details on each type of structure, the types of materials they would treat, and then some maintenance needs. And then the EPA has published examples of stormwater pollution prevention plans and documentation forms. The link is below, and these are a good guide to what we're looking for on the basic level in your stormwater pollution prevention plan, and then also what you should be looking for during your routine inspections. And then TDEC also has a specific sector link for every permit. I believe Josh had a slide on it. And you should review and know your sector specific requirements. Okay, why comply? The obvious answers are to avoid enforcement, and then to avoid any sort of citizen lawsuit or court proceedings. But I think most importantly, these regulations and permits are in place to protect our waterways, our infrastructure, and also protect our ability to use, access, and recreate in these waters. And then our take-home message is basically the first question you want to ask is, do you have the right permit coverage? The best thing to do would be to reach out either to us or TDEC to make sure you do have the right permit in place. Make sure that you have a good site plan in place and that it addresses all the material you store on your site. Make sure that it is being followed and you are always documenting and updating the plan. And also ensuring that employees are trained on the plan. Making sure you report spills to the appropriate agencies and that employees are trained on how to clean up these spills. Maintain good housekeeping practices. And then know what to expect when we are going to come out and do an inspection. I think this has helped you and given you an overview of what we're looking at, both paperwork wise and when we're going through the field inspection. And then always routinely evaluate your site. Even if you are not required to do routine inspections, you should always be evaluating your site and considering what improvements can be made. And then I think that's it.
Thanks, Allison. Did a great job. We're going to open it up for any questions regarding stormwater runoff and permits or anything that we just presented. And I think Allison is going to change the setting where it'll allow you to unmute yourself. So if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself. You should be able to, in the participants page, or I think in the bottom, there should be a mute button that will allow yourself to unmute yourself.
Okay, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hey Allison, this is Tony with Vulcan. Just wanted to say good job, very informative, and really the only question I got is, and I think you answered this, will a copy of this presentation be sent out to the group?
Yes, it will. And we'll do that after Andy Welch completes his presentation. Any other questions?
Hi, Allison. I have a question for you.
Hi.
And I apologize if you guys covered this and I missed it, but working towards no exposure certificate for a site, the only thing that we're kind of hung up on or needing some clarification on is we have a standalone loading dock, and I'm wondering how that falls under the loading, unloading. We don't load or unload any type of liquids, waste, anything like that. It's all finished product. So I was doing some digging around, and it's some stuff says that we need to have that dock covered. Would that be the case, where we need to get some covering over top of that loading dock, even though it's only finished final product and there's no spill potential there or release potential?
Josh, would you know the specifics for it?
Yeah, so the short answer is you need to kind of verify with TDEC, because they're ultimately the one that will sign off on the no exposure certification.
Okay.
But based on my experiences, if the material is packaged and there's no residual product or anything exposed, then you may be okay. And I would pursue it. Again, TDEC makes the ultimate call, but if it's packaged up and wrapped up and there's no chance of material leaking, you're just loading it onto trucks, that, in my mind at least, would say that you don't have exposure. But again, you would need to contact TDEC to verify that, as they make the ultimate decision.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Good presentation. Thank you.
Allison, I had one quick note as we maybe give folks one last opportunity to come up with any questions, if I could.
Okay.
Appreciate your presentation, Josh. You and Allison, very well done. I would just offer to the attendees a couple of notes. One, as you can see, our involvement could almost be perceived as a service. I know that there is a potential we could find things wrong, but we do work very hard to facilitate sites being in compliance, and would want to help if you want to, like the one gentleman had asked about, pursue no exposure. That's preferable. But the one thing I wanted to mention, having been involved with the NPDES permit system for several years, for those of you that maybe don't have a lot of experience with it, is to not lose sight of the fact that this is born out of a federal statute, and as such, it does carry some significance. So when you're pulling these permits and being involved with these permits, just realize there is some significance. There was a reference to the potential for private lawsuits. And I think the one thing I would always recommend and tell people, just whatever you do, don't ever falsify information on your reports, and just try to stay on top of things. But for those of you just getting into this business as it relates to MPDS permit, just know there is some underlying significance to these requirements and complying with them, which is a good segue to back. If you ever have any questions, don't hesitate to get with our folks. They'll be more than happy to help you out.
I guess one last check to see if there's any questions. Of course, you can always email. You'll have Allison's email address. She'll send the slides out. And then the email address on this page comes to both Allison and myself. But any last minute questions before we probably take a 5-minute break and then go into pre-treatment and discharges to our sanitary sewer. All right. Well, we'll take a quick 5-minute break. We're probably going to mute y'all again. And then when we come back, Andy Welch will go into discharges to the sanitary sewer from industrial activities.
Andy, I just made you presenter. Andy, the screen with the next slide option is the one that's showing right now.
Okay, I'll see if I can fix that. Does that look right now?
Yes.
Okay. Let me know when we're ready. Thank you.
Maybe give it just one more minute and then you can start.
Okay.
I think you can probably start.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Welch. I'm over the manager over our environmental compliance section, which covers industrial pretreatment, our food service establishment, fats, oils, and grease program, and another number of other things primarily involved with regulating discharges to the sanitary sewer. We also do some water quality, have some water quality programs as well. So if you have an industrial sanitary sewer discharge permit, you may know me, but you're more likely to be working with Marty Mast or Al Pogue, who have been our primary inspectors and regulators for a number of years for industrial pretreatment. This first slide, or at least the first portion of it, should look familiar. Clean Water Act established in 1972. Josh mentioned that. I guess the difference between this presentation and the last presentation we were talking about your NPDES permit. On this one, we're talking about our permit, our being Metro Water Services. We have 3 NPDES permits for what some of us who have been around a while will call, out of habit, a wastewater treatment plant. The new term is water reclamation plant. If you have an industrial permit, you can look at it and you will know which plant you go to. The permit number is basically 2 letters and then a dash and a number. Those first 2 letters represent the plant that you discharge to. CP for our central plant, which is just north of downtown. WC for our Whites Creek plant, which is on the west side of town on County Hospital Road, and DC for our Dry Creek plant, which is in the Rivergate area. So you must have an NPDES permit to discharge, and that permit provides us limits on what we can discharge, our monitoring and reporting requirements, and other rules that we have to meet. So in 1973, as part of the Clean Water Act, there was the first proposal of pretreatment standards. What pretreatment refers to is basically regulation of discharges prior to reaching the treatment plant, thus pre-treatment. So that had pretreatment standards, prohibited discharges, pretreatment of compatible and incompatible pollutants, and timeline for compliance with those standards. In 1978, they basically improved upon those regulations. And then in 2005, they quote unquote streamlined the regulations, basically trying to accomplish what we had been accomplishing, though making it easier for both us and you to maintain compliance. So what are we trying to accomplish with a pre-treatment program? Number one, prevention of pass-through. 2, prevention of interference, protection of the quality of municipal sludge, as well as worker safety. So what's pass-through? Discharge which exits the POTW into the waters of the U.S., etc. POTW, publicly owned treatment works. What that refers to specifically is the treatment plant itself and any related infrastructure, including the sewers, pumping stations, etc. So basically, our treatment plant is designed to treat, in general, compatible pollutants, BOD, suspended solids, fats, oils, and grease, not designed to treat certain other types of waste. Any waste that passes through because either it's more than we can treat, a greater concentration, or because we are unable to treat it with our treatment process, that is a pass-through violation. Interference is basically, let's start over. It's a discharge which alone or in conjunction with a discharge or discharges from other sources inhibits or disrupts the POTW, treatment processes, sludge processes, and so forth. So the way the treatment plant in general works is it is a biological treatment facility. In other words, we introduce microbes and create an environment that allows them to break down the waste stream. If that process is in any way disrupted, you dump something that kill all the microbes, for example, then that is an interference. Municipal sludge quality. As part of the treatment process, we remove a fair amount of solids that is either landfilled or land applied. In other words, used for beneficial reuse after additional treatment. We try to land apply what we can. What we can't is landfilled. And so basically anything you landfill or land apply has certain met standards that must be met to make it safe to do so. So part of the program is to maintain the quality so that it is safe to dispose of it or reuse it as the case may be. And worker safety. Obviously, if you're working in or near the sewers, we want you to be safe. So we've got 4 types of pretreatment standards: general, specific, categorical, and local limits. General prohibition, user may not introduce into a POTW any pollutant which causes pass-through or interference. We've already covered those 2 terms, so that should be pretty self-evident. The specific prohibitions, all these link back to one or more of the intentions of the program. Pollutants which create a fire or explosive hazard, worker safety, potentially interference as well. Pollutants which will cause corrosive or structural damage to the POTW, interference. Solid or viscous pollutants, obviously interference. Pollutants released at a flow rate or concentration causing interference. Heat and amounts which will inhibit biological activity resulting in interference. Oils that will cause interference or pass-through. Pollutants which result in the presence of toxic gases, vapors, or fumes, worker safety. Trucked or hauled pollutants except at discharge points designated by the POTW. That's more of a regulatory thing, making sure that we can keep an eye on such discharges. These are the sort of the top 8. All of these appear in your industrial discharge permit, and there are several others. I'll go ahead and mention number 9, which is do not discharge any clean stormwater or groundwater to the sanitary sewer. That's more appropriately discharged via your NPDES permit, and we have plenty of dirty water to treat. We do not want to treat any clean water that does not need treatment. As an aside, that also can contribute to overflows of the sanitary sewer during rain events and such. Categorical standards. Certain types of industrial processes are covered by categorical standards. These are determined by the federal government. They're technology-based standards called Effluent Limitation Guidelines. The intent is to, I guess, part of the intent is to create a fair across-the-board regulation of similar facilities. For example, if you have an electroplating facility in New York, you're going to have the same regulations as you do in Nashville, as you do in California, as you do in Boise, etc. The other part of that is to technically determine what are the best reasonable treatment methods for a particular pollutant in a particular type of facility, and use that to determine the standard. Some types of facilities that have categorical standards that apply to them are electroplating facilities, metal finishing, plastic molding and forming, metals molding and casting, electrical and electronic components, pharmaceuticals, and there are quite a number of others. Local standards, as opposed to categorical standards, are determined by your local authority, your control authority. The control authority is basically the local regulating body. In that case, it would be us. So we determine those limits, and then those limits are approved by the approval authority, which in our case would be TDEC. So basically, every few years, we do some calculations specific to each particular treatment plant, as far as what we know is coming in, what the treatment plant can handle, and in general, what potential pollutants there might be. So that is a number that is calculated using known data, as well as certain standard numbers that are used in the calculation. And we come up with that every few years. So who is regulated? We are required to regulate all significant industrial users. So first of all, that are the categorical industrial users. In other words, if you meet a federal category, we are obligated to regulate and permit you. If you discharge 25,000 gallons per day or more of processed wastewater, we are obligated to permit you. It excludes sanitary non-contact cooling, boiler blowdown. If you contribute a processed waste stream that makes up 5% or more of the average dry weather, hydraulic, or organic capacity of the plant. In our particular case, I don't know that anyone meets that requirement. Our plants are large enough that it doesn't really come into play. If you have a reasonable potential to adversely affect the POTW, then you are required to be, or you are made an SIU. That's basically sort of set up so that if there's anyone in particular that the control authority feels like they need to watch that doesn't meet the other requirements, we can designate them as that. So that's purely up to our judgment, as long as we have a rationale behind that. Now, how do you know if you are a significant industrial user? If we are inspecting you on an annual basis, then that is specifically because you are an industrial user. So Al or Marty is coming by to see you once a year at minimum, specifically for an inspection, which is in addition to some sampling that we do. So what are we required to do? Let me back up for just a minute. We do permit and regulate facilities that would be considered non-significant or not significant. That is, once again, a judgment call on our part. These are places that we think might be of concern for whatever reason, but are not, or we want to keep an eye on them. They are not necessarily potentially going to end up being an SIU if they grow, though some might. There's another category of facility, I should say type of facility, that is even less of a concern, that we watch, we regulate. We may not issue you a permit, but you may see us doing some sampling every year or so. So if you are a significant industrial user, we are going to be inspecting you at least once a year, as I just said. We are going to be we are required to maintain a compliance monitoring database of your sampling, your inspections, etc. We are required to issue notices of violations when necessary. We are required to apply enforcement actions consistent with an enforcement response plan. That is a plan that is determined by us and approved by the control authority. And we attempt to be any enforcement actions, use that as a guide. We are required to develop, enforce, and update local limits as required. And typically that is done when our NPDES permit is renewed, which is every 5 years. That way, when there are changes in our requirements, we can adjust your requirements accordingly. So federal government requires you to complete a new application at minimum every 5 years. We choose to do this every 3 years. And then the permit identifies who you are. It provides you with the local regulations as well as the categorical limits if you are a categorical facility. Whichever limit is stricter is the one that you must meet. It provides plant protection criteria. Basically, that is the limit that we are testing for at the influent of our plant. If we see that we are not meeting that, then we start looking around at industrial and other users to see what is going wrong there. It tells you what sampling you must do, sampling and monitoring, and what requirements you have for record keeping. It provides the general and specific prohibitions, which we've already mentioned, and it lists types of violations and penalties. So inspections. Our inspection is a little bit different than what the NPDES group is doing. They are using that primarily as an enforcement tool, as I understand it. Though certainly if we see some compliance issues, we will address them. Our inspection is more intended to be an educational opportunity for us and for you. So it allows us to basically know who we need to contact at your plant regarding issues involving your industrial discharge permit. Make sure you know who to get in touch with on our side. Allows us to check the accuracy of that application, making sure that we're permitting you for the correct things. Lets us learn about the type and size, how big of an operation you are, what times of day and what days of the week you are operational. Allows us to identify any chemicals and materials present so that we know what potential the impact you have, not necessarily what you're discharging, but what you have on site that could potentially be discharged. allows us to understand your process, and also lets us inspect and understand any treatment system that you have on site that you use to treat your waste stream prior to discharge to us. Once a year, we decide if you need a slug control plan. So basically, a slug is any atypical, typically concentrated discharge to the POTW. A spill is a slug. A slug is not necessarily a spill, as some atypical discharges might be planned. And if you do that, we encourage you to contact us before you discharge those. We also identify solid, liquid, and hazardous waste streams, see how you're disposing those. We identify sampling location. We make sure that you are sampling at the correct location and that you or the laboratory you contract with are using the proper techniques to collect that sample, analyze it. We review records on sampling, permits, correspondence, waste disposal. And a note on that, so about once a year, TDEC will inspect us. And when they inspect us, they pull out several files that they are looking at our records of, making sure the permit that we've issued is in line with what needs to be issued. And one of the things they do to determine that is they will pick several of those files that they pulled and say, well, we want to go with you being Metro Water Services, to meet with plant personnel at that facility and do an inspection. We generally only have a day or two's notice of who they are going to inspect. So don't be surprised if you get a call wanting us to inspect your facility. Really, that is the only time we are not going to give you a lot of notice, other than if we perceive there's some kind of danger or other critical time crucial circumstance. So if we're calling with a day's notice, that's the state. So one of the things that they are looking at, and to be clear, they are not looking at you. They are looking at us. They are looking at you to understand what you do, but really they are making sure that we know who you are and that we understand what you do. So if you want to irritate your compliance officer a little bit, when we show up with the state, you can go, now who are you? And what do you do? I've never seen you before in my life. Now, if you do that, you probably ought to fess up pretty quickly and let them know it's a joke, or we might not be able to get along very well. But something fun to do if you are comfortable enough with your compliance inspector to do that. So basically, like I said, he or she is looking at the same thing that we're looking at in our process, making sure our records match up with what you have on site. So if you are a significant industrial user, and in some cases, if you are not a significant industrial user, we do require you to do some sampling. There are some permits of non-industrial use or non-significant users that do not require any sampling. So basically, any tests that we require you to make must be done as per 304 of the Clean Water Act. General reference guide in most cases is standard methods of water and wastewater examination, sort of the Bible of water quality analysis. And when you do that sampling, you must provide the date, exact place, method, and time of sampling, and names of the persons taking the sample, data analysis were performed, who performed those, analytical techniques used, results of such analysis and a signed certification statement that basically is saying that this is a representative sample and to the best of your knowledge, it is true and accurate information. So when deciding when to sample, keep the following things in mind. Sampling dates should be chosen at random on a day of normal operation. Doing your once a year plant cleaning, probably not a good day to sample. Everybody's off for a particular reason and you're not discharging much, not a good day to do a sample. Do not sample the same date each month or the same day each week in order so that you may capture seasonal and operational variation. We had one facility, they were sampling on I think the 10th of the month, every month. We were doing our sampling, moving that around from day to day and month to month. Their numbers were always similar with their numbers and looked nothing like our numbers. So it looked fishy, but it was just because they had it on a very regular schedule. Once they moved it around a little bit, their numbers started matching our numbers. Do not knowingly make any false statement on a report that may be subject to criminal prosecution. So like I said, you are vouching that your sample is representative and accurate to the best of your knowledge. So what that means, and this is a real life thing, is if you tell us that you're sampling on your better days because you figure we catch your bad days and you're trying to even it out, then you are not choosing a representative sample and you have just admitted to fraud. Be aware of that. Now, something that should be mentioned is these sampling rules are specifically in reference to sampling that you take at your sample point as per EPA requirements. If you're using a little Hawk meter or some other type of portable meter, you're not calling your laboratory to track a waste stream in some way that is not fully approved by standard methods. That is an in-house use of that or in-house analysis. Though we may want to see that, that is not information that is used for regulatory purpose and not information that you are obligated to submit to us. So what kind of violations are there? Chronic violation is anything in which 2/3 of your measurements taken during any 6-month period exceed the maximum limit or the average limit for the same pollutant parameter. An average limit generally only comes into play with categorical facilities. The daily maximum is usually what's used for local, but that does apply to categorical parameters as well. Technical review criteria, those in which 1/3 or more of all measurements exceed the parameter taken during a 6-month period, exceeds the product of the daily maximum limit or the average limit multiplied by the applicable TRC, technical review criteria, 1.4 for the compatible pollutants and 1.2 for all other pollutants except pH. Note that we do not, with the exception of ammonia, we do not have a limit for categorical pollutants. We have a surcharge level. So basically what that means is for those types of pollutants, you're basically just paying for the cost that you cause for us to treat that excessive strength waste, unless of course it causes a pass-through or interference. Now, ammonia, even though that is compatible and surchargeable, there is a maximum on that as well. And Last, any other violation that we determine has caused an interference or pass-through, including endangering public health or POTW personnel health. Any discharge of a pollutant that has caused an imminent danger to human health, welfare, or the environment has resulted in the MPOTW's exercise of its emergency authority. And then we're on to reporting violations. Failure to meet within 90 days after a scheduled date, a compliance schedule milestone. And we'll talk about compliance schedule milestones a little bit later. Contained in a local control mechanism or enforcement order for starting construction, completing construction, or attaining final compliance. Failure to provide within 30 days after due date required reports, such as a baseline monitoring report, 90-day compliance reports, periodic self-monitoring reports, and etc. So if we have a due date on your permit for sampling or any other particular kind of report for response to a notice of violation, etc., if you are 30 days late, that is an additional violation. That comes later. Failure to accurately report noncompliance is a violation. Any other violation that we determine will adversely affect the operation or implementation of the local pretreatment program. So non-significant violations include a failure to file a renewal application, but you continue to comply with the permit. Your report a spill with no known adverse effects. Isolated once per 6 month period and not in consecutive sampling events, or insignificant excessiveness of the discharge limits. Inadvertently using incorrect sample collection procedures, failure to properly sign or certify monitoring reports, failure to notify of a slug load which has no known adverse effects, missed interim or final compliance deadline by 30 days or less. So we are obligated to issue a notice of violation that we discover by the authority. The only exception is if the violation occurs on your sampling and you self-report it. Basically, we won't send you a nasty letter at that point, but you're still expected to address the problem. So if you receive a notice of violation, what should you do? You should send us a written response stating the action that you will take to resolve this violation and obtain compliance within 10 days. That doesn't mean you have to have figured out what the problem was and know how to fix it within 10 days. That means we need a letter in our office that tells us what you are doing to make that determination if you haven't already made it. You have 45 days to actually achieve compliance. But in the event that it's not feasible, you can include in that letter a time frame that you think you can achieve compliance by, and assuming that we think that it's reasonable, we will usually accept that. So once the enforcement and penalties are determined once again by the enforcement response plan. Enforcement response guide, I think, is the term I used earlier. Most non-compliant, significant, and non-significant will result in a notice of violation. Some significant non-compliant notice of violations, depending on severity, may also result in an administrative order. That is basically an order where we specifically tell you what you have to accomplish to address the situation. That can be an agreed order. In other words, If we both know that you have a problem and you submit a solution to address that, and we agree on it, that becomes an agreed order. Some significant noncompliance violations, depending on severity, may result in monetary penalties. Your permit indicates that you're subject of a penalty of up to $10,000 per day per violation. The reality is, if you have reasonable problems and are making reasonable attempts to address those issues, then any monetary penalties will be minimal or won't happen. If you have an unusual problem or you are failing to address a normal problem over a period of time, that is when those monetary penalties are likely to kick in. So we mentioned 30-day deadline for reporting. There's actually two deadlines. There's the deadline in your industrial user permit. For example, it might say that you have to submit a report to us on your sampling every 30th of March and every 30th of September. So that's deadline number one. Well, you decide you're going to get ahead of the game and sample that, do that March sampling in January. That's great. We would encourage you to do that, and you'll see why in a moment. One of the reasons why, anyway. But once you take that sample, the clock starts ticking, and if you have not gotten us that information in 30 days, then that is also a violation. Any sampling that you do at your official sample point, as per standard methods, must be submitted. That is to prevent you from taking pre-samples during a reporting period and picking the best one. You can sample as much as you want. And some people, if they are trying to get a handle on a particular problem or trying to get their surcharge average at a reasonable level, may choose to sample more. It's just fine. If a self-sample is in violation, you must report it within 24 hours of becoming aware of it. In other words, as soon as your lab notifies you that you are out, the clock is ticking. In general, if you find out on Friday afternoon, we're not going to be terribly upset with you if you wait till Monday morning to tell us, assuming it is not something that's likely to impact the plant. You must then resample within 30 days of the initial sampling. If by chance we happen to do sampling in that 30 days and prove that you are back in compliance, we've saved you the trouble. And that is purely a by chance kind of thing. Record keeping, the following records are required. You must have your industrial user's permit and permit application on file. You must have all correspondence that we send to you, that you send to us. Copies of that must be on file. Self-sampling reports and sampling reports that we send to you must be on file. Any waste disposal manifest for waste disposed in any way for any reason must be on file. Spill prevention and slug control plans, if required, must be on file. And any and all other documents required by your industrial user permit. And I would encourage you to make sure that there are several people at your facility that knows where those records are. That way, if something does come up and you're not there, we do have a way to get that information. And that concludes my presentation. I've got a few references. I think we're going to send this out as well. These references, these are good sources of what you can learn if you need more information about anything I've covered today. And I'm going to attempt to give the screen back to Allison and turn it back over to her.
Well, I guess this would be a good time if there's any questions for Andy pertaining to his presentation. I will unmute everyone. So you can now unmute yourself if you have any questions. Any follow-up questions? If not, I think we can probably conclude this workshop. Thank you all for attending and
Hey,
Um,
Allison.
yeah.
Let me just add one thing. If you think of any questions after the fact, you're welcome to email us at ECO, that stands for Environmental Compliance Office at Nashville.gov. And that is specifically for any industrial pretreatment questions.
Okay, well, we'll send our presentation and Andy's presentation along with that email address and our contact information as well. If there's any questions that come up that you want to reach out about.